This is the part 2 of week 11 lecture on intergovernmental administration. I had already introduced federalism in Pakistan, so let's continue with that. So you can say we are doing a quick fast forward to the 18th constitutional amendment, which is also part of our 1973 constitution. And it's a pity that we haven't been able to do this 18th constitutional amendment in a face-to-face lecture. I've been discussing this 18th amendment quite a lot before mids as well. So I really wanted to discuss it with you guys in person, but let's just discuss it here. So, what is the 18th Constitutional Amendment? It's considered a landmark constitutional amendment which was passed back in April 2010. And the idea for coming up with this legislation or this constitutional amendment was that it basically restored Pakistan constitution to its original intent of a decentralized federation of provinces. So, from 1973 constitution up till 18 constitutional amendment, which was passed in April 2010, a lot of changes happened in your constitution, especially during the time of military dictatorships. And during these military dictatorships, your army general or your president or the dictator had actually changed the very design of the constitution by empowering the office of the president more than the office of the prime minister. And in these legislations or during these constitutional changes, what happened was that your central government was actually empowered as opposed to your provincial governments during these military dictatorships. So we know that in 2008, we finally sort of overthrew the military dictatorship and a democratic government came to power. And a key hallmark of this democratic government, which was the PPP government, was actually the passage of the 18th Amendment, right? So, this particular 18th Amendment was actually sort of overseen by Senator Raza Rabbani of PPP, and basically composed of 26 members of the Parliamentary Committee on Constitutional Reforms. And these members were just not members from the sitting government, which is at that time was PPP, but rather it was actually part of both the opposition members as well as the sitting government as well. So, this particular 18th constitutional amendment basically contained a total of 102 amendments in the constitution, and these amendments either amended, which is like changed, substituted, added, or deleted various provisions of the constitution. So, there were different ways in which the constitution was actually changed, right? So, those bits where provisions were deleted, which were included by the military dictators, and those bits were added, which enhance the decentralized nature of our constitution. So let's go through some of the features of the 18th Amendment. So first of all, one of the major change in this amendment which was proposed by this amendment, was that it basically expanded the definition of high treason, right? So I think I mentioned it in our previous lecture as well. Our Article 6 of the Constitution basically defines what high treason is. So, according to that article, high treason includes any act which basically suspends the constitution of Pakistan, right? So, if a person, according to this definition, if a person tries to suspend the constitution by actually enforcing a military coup, or by establishing a military dictatorship, that would be an act of high treason. So now the thing was that this particular Article 6 was already in place in your constitution prior to the dictatorships of General Ayub, General Zia, and General Musharraf, right? Despite the presence of this Article 6, our military dictators were able to actually get their military dictatorships legitimized by your Supreme Court judges, by your High Court judges. Now, the question is, why did they get these dictatorships validated? So, in our law, or you can say in our um, sort of judicial history, our judges have been using this doctrine of necessity, right? What is this doctrine of necessity? So, this doctrine of necessity basically validates the suspension of constitution if the judges say that a certain issue had arisen or a certain crisis had arisen in the country, that they were basically saying that it's okay to cancel or suspend the constitution. What kind of issue or crisis could occur? If there was like mass civil unrest in the country, or if there was a lot of corruption happening in the country. So these judges were basically saying that if these things are happening, or these if a crisis situation is happening, then uh, because of these political developments, it's okay to actually suspend the constitution. So a lot of military dictatorships in the past have been legitimized by the judges because of this doctrine of necessity, right? So in other words, your judges, which are supposed to uphold the supremacy of constitution, are basically allowing the suspension of constitution by military dictatorships. So that was happening prior to the 18th amendment. After the 18th amendment, the this article 6 was sort of changed or expanded. It expanded the definition of high treason by not only including the generals who would abrogate or suspend the constitution, but it also brought in loop these judges who would validate the suspension of constitution by the usage of doctrine of necessity. So in other words, after this change in sort of article 6, now that you can safely say that there is no room for bringing a military dictatorship, or for bringing a coup, or by suspending the constitution, because the idea is that this particular constitutional provision sends a strong message to future dictators or future generals that you will be strictly dealt by the courts as well, and in order, if you try to attempt to suspend the constitution in the future. Another feature of the 18th Amendment was that it basically increased the number of fundamental rights within our Constitution. If you guys remember, I showed you guys the entire Constitution prior to MIDS, and there was an entire chapter on fundamental rights. So after the 18th Amendment, you had new rights included. For instance, this right of fair trial was included, right to information was included, and the right to education as well, right? So moving on, another key feature of the 18th Amendment was reduction in the powers of the president. It basically means that I mentioned previously that during different military dictators, the power of the president was actually accumulated quite a lot during the past, especially through this article called Article 58(2)(b). As a result of that, your president could actually dissolve the National Assembly, or at any point can call a referendum on certain issues related to the country. So, after the 18th Amendment, your powers of the president were actually reduced, and it was actually written that your president can no longer dissolve the National Assembly. He is no longer the power or authority to do so, and he can no longer refer any question to the referendum. And this particular feature is associated with this phenomena that changing or reducing the power of president actually brought back the 1973 constitution in its original form, whereby the prime minister, as opposed to the president, is actually really empowered and he gets to call all the shots. Moving on, so another major feature of the 18th Amendment is basically this removal of bar on the third term of the office of Prime Minister and Chief Minister. So prior to the 18th Amendment, you could become a Prime Minister or Chief Minister only for 2 terms. So you cannot hold these offices for more than 2 terms. So this particular bar was actually removed in the 18th Amendment, and it basically allowed individuals to become prime ministers and chief ministers for the third time as well. And if you guys remember history, this basically paved the way for, let's say, Shehbaz Sharif to become a chief minister again, and for Nawaz Sharif to become a prime minister again, because they're already completed their 2 terms beforehand. The fifth and probably the most important feature of the 18th Amendment was that it basically abolished the concurrent list. Remember, I showed you that in the 1973 Constitution, there's this concurrent list and there's the federal legislative list. So, this particular constitution removed this concurrent list, and it basically granted greater sort of autonomy to provincial assemblies in terms of the type of laws that they could pass. Um, and hereby, what happened was that any matter which was not related to, which was not mentioned in the federal legislative list, was actually given to the provinces. So, you, in a bit, I'll show you exactly what is included in the federal legislative list, and I'll show you how this particular amendment empowered the provinces. So, for the purpose of our lecture, this particular feature is the most important in terms of intergovernmental relations between the national government and the provincial government, because this particular feature empowered, or you can say, gave a lot of autonomy to the provinces, right? So, just before we move on, just to let you guys know, so this amendment, as I mentioned, was passed in 2010, and we are currently in 2020. So, you can say that it's been almost 10 years since the passage of this amendment. So, even though the amendment has been passed for almost a decade now. However, it hasn't been completely implemented, executed, right? Because when a lot of these functions were given to the provincial governments, they were actually not equipped, or they did not have the right capacity to implement these functions. As a result of that, we actually see a partial, or maybe more than partial, implementation of the 18th Amendment, whereby some features are still held by your federal government, essentially. So let's move on. So these are basically all the functions which are performed by your federal government or your national government. So in your constitution, you can actually see this federal legislative list, part 1, right? These are all the matters written in your constitution that can only be legislated by your national government or by your central government. So what do these include? You have this portfolio of defense, I've already mentioned. Defense policy only need to be made by your central government. Similarly, it includes policies related to external affairs, immigration and citizenship, um, matters related to post and telecommunications, matter related to fishing beyond territorial waters, standards of weights and measures in terms of whether you want to use kilograms or you want to use kilometers or miles, etc. Right? So we don't use miles, for instance. Similarly, matters related to international and interprovincial trade, nuclear energy, related to airports, matters related to patents, national highways, local governments, and cantonment areas. So all of these functions are to be legislated by your provincial government. And in terms of provincial responsibilities, all the leftover functions, which are residual functions, are going to be done by your provincial governments. And when it comes to local government responsibilities, here these responsibilities are to be determined by your provincial government. So provincial government decides whether it wants to empower local government in terms of carrying out certain development projects or not. The discretion lies with the provincial governments. Moving on, so, in our constitution, apart from having a federal legislative list part 1, we also have a federal legislative list part 2. Okay, so this is important. So, in this particular federal legislative list, it contains all the matters in which the federal legislation can only legislate on after consultation with the provinces through CCI. So, what is CCI? In a bit, in subsequent slides, I'll explain you what CCI is. It's basically the Council of Common Interest. So, these subjects basically include um, all of the sort of matters which need to be collectively designed or defined or legislated with your provincial governments, right? And some of these subjects were actually part of your concurrent list prior to the which we had prior to the 18th Amendment. So matters related to electricity, matter related to railways, major ports, related to public debt, all of these matters need to be legislated collectively by the federal government as well as the provincial government. Matter related to your provincial police operations beyond provincial boundaries, matters related to industrial policy, standards in higher education, research, etc. Right? And this bit is important that your Council of Common Interest also decides matters related to your interprovincial matters and constitution. So I hope you guys understand that your constitution consists of a federal legislative part 1 and federal legislative part 2. So part 1 only deals with matters that can be legislated by the central government, and federal legislative part 2 deals with matter that need to be designed or made into policies in coordination or in close cooperation with the provincial governments. As a result of the 18th Amendment, quite a few agencies, or you can say federal ministries or divisions, were actually abolished because those portfolios were taken away from the federal government and given to the provincial government. So let's go through some of these ministries which were abolished. So Food and Agriculture Ministry was abolished, and this policy matter was designated to the provincial matters. Similarly, health, education, which were previously held by the federal government, and the federal government would come up with centralized, you can say, curriculum for the entire country, would make centralized health related policies. All of these ministries were actually abolished, and this particular portfolio was given to the provincial government. So, currently, if you're following the news related to COVID-19, a lot of debate has been that whether the provincial governments actually have the capacity on their level to take up or to take care of this health portfolio. Similarly, a lot of people have debated whether education should have been given to the provincial government. So there are sort of individuals on both sides of the debate. Some people think that in order to have a coherent education policy, it makes sense. Then the center basically designs the education policy for the entire country. But proponents who believe in greater decentralization and policy matters, they say that it makes sense that since each province has their own, political realities or their own cultural heritage, it makes sense to actually devise or design the curriculum according to the needs of each province. Similarly, other agencies or other policy matters which were previously with the federal government, they were given to the provincial government, such as social welfare and special education, youth affairs, population welfare, sports, culture, all of these functions were devolved to the provincial level. Similarly, life policy matters related to livestock and dairy, matters related to labor and manpower, minorities, tourism, which was previously a domain in which the federal government would only work on. Now it has been devolved to the provincial government. Similarly, in women development related initiatives, zakat and usher related matters, all of these things have been given to the provincial matters as a result of the 18th Amendment. So just to reiterate, all of these functions were previously part of the domain of the federal ministries or the federal government, but after the 18th Amendment, provinces were empowered more, they were given more autonomy to take up these policy matters as well. So it has been nearly 10 years that the 18th Amendment has been passed, and it's still sort of debated among policy circles whether the provincial governments have been able to develop capacities related to all of these functions. And you can say that a major criticism of the 18th Amendment during the time of its passage was that you sort of overhauled the passage of 18th Amendment without actually empowering or sort of giving some sort of capacity building training to the provinces in order to take up these key policy matters, right? So let's move on. So now we are going to discuss some of the key agencies which are involved in performing intergovernmental administration in the case of Pakistan. If you guys remember from the previous slides, I mentioned to you guys that a key feature of all federal states of the world is that these countries need to have some sort of institutional mechanism whereby different sort of matters between the different tiers of the government need to be dealt with or need to be coordinated or facilitated. So, as a result of that, different federal states of the world have sort of come up with different sort of institutional mechanisms where they can actually coordinate policy matters between the different layers or different levels of the government. So, what institutions do we have in Pakistan? So, we have this Council of Common Interest and we have Interprovincial Coordination Division. So, these are just some of the institutional mechanisms, some of the most important institutional mechanisms which are available in the case of Pakistan. So, let's go through these one by one. So let's start with Council of Common Interest. It's a constitutional body, first of all. It was created through the 1973 Constitution. And the key purpose of why it has been created is that it has been sort of designated to formulate and update policies in relations to matter in part 2 of the federal legislative list, which I had previously shown you when I was explaining the 18th Amendment. And I had also already mentioned that this particular legislative list deals with matters which are related to railways, electricity, major ports, national planning, and national economic coordination. So these policy matters cannot be sort of decided or legislated upon unilaterally by the federal government, but rather you need to involve the provincial government as well as the federal government to come up with these policies related to these matters. And just to let you guys know, so this particular thing, the first bullet, this has happened, or this particular portfolio has been given to the Council of Common Interest after the passage of 18th Amendment. If you guys remember, prior to the 18th Amendment, we had a concurrent list as well. So back then, the Council of Common Interest would actually pay attention, would take up all the matters on the concurrent list. But after the 18th Amendment, it is now responsible for part 2 of the federal legislative list since the concurrent list has been abolished. Right, so another key feature of this CCI is that there needs to be interprovincial coordination. Any matter or any sort of issue that arises or which concerns multiple provinces at the same time. Let's say we can take an example of the construction of a dam. So, if the dam affects the population of two or more provinces, naturally the building of this dam needs to be decided collectively through this mechanism of Council of Common Interest. Lastly, another key feature of this CCI is that if any dispute arises between one or two provinces, then CCI basically provides the mechanism for resolving these disputes between the provinces, right? So moving on. So in terms of the formulation of Council of Common Interest, it's basically comprised of a Prime Minister, the Chief Ministers of all the provinces, and it also includes 3 members from the federal government. And your Prime Minister, your sitting Prime Minister, gets to decide which one of these 3 members are going to be part of CCI. So, just to let you guys know that CCI is not itself a new institution, it was already present prior to the 18th Amendment. However, the key feature of CCI prior to the passage of 18th Amendment was that there was no permanent chairman and no secretariat, right? What does that mean? That this particular body was sort of an ad hoc institutional mechanism whereby there was no permanent office located for the work of Council of Common Interest. And another key issue with this particular institution was that there was no regulation that regular meetings need to be held for the Council of Common Interest. Before the passage of 18th Amendment, in the previous years, like from 1973 up till 2010, the Council of Common Interest only met for around a minimum of 10 meetings actually. So after the 18th Amendment, this particular amendment actually empowered the role of Council of Common Interest. And the key change or the key feature which was introduced as a result of the 18th Amendment was that this council needs to be provided a permanent secretariat so that it no longer is actually dealt in an ad hoc manner. And there was another stipulation that this CCI needs to meet at least once in 90 days. So it's basically making it mandatory that after the expiration of 90 days, you have to meet for a session for Council of Common Interest. So, as a result of the 18th Amendment, now the Secretariat of the CCI has been made this Inter-Provincial Coordination Division. And let's go through what this particular division is. So, the mandate of Interprovincial Coordination Division is generally to ensure a coordination between the federal government and provinces in different matters related to economic affairs, cultural and administrative affairs. Similarly, another key mandate of this particular division is that it promotes uniformity of approach in terms of how policies are formulated and implemented. The idea is that you create greater harmony in terms of policy formulation among the provinces and the federal government. Similarly, another role of the division is to discuss policy issues which stem from the provinces, which have actually administrative or economic consequences for the country as a whole, right? So, if one province, again, going back to the dam example, if one province decides to fulfill its water needs by constructing a dam, then naturally the construction or the building of this particular dam is going to have the consequences for the rest of the country as well. And lastly, as previously mentioned, another role of the Interprovincial Coordination Division is that all the secretarial work, all the meetings that need to be arranged for the Council of Common Interest, they are basically looked after by Interprovincial Coordination Division. So let's move on. So now we are going to talk about fiscal federalism in Pakistan. In the previous slides, I basically explained to you guys what fiscal federalism in general is. So the idea is that in these couple of slides, I'm going to walk you through how fiscal federalism happens in the case of Pakistan. So if you guys remember, so fiscal federalism is just how you basically divide up public finances among different tiers of the government. So, in the case of Pakistan, we have this institutional mechanism or a constitutional obligation, which is called the National Finance Commission, NFC. It's also called just NFC award as well. It's a constitutional obligation, which means that it's mandated by the constitution. And the reason for creation of this award is to ensure distribution of financial resources between the federal government and the provincial governments. So, just to let you guys know that when it comes to distribution of federal government resources between the federal government and the provincial government, naturally the question arises, how do you raise these taxes? So in the previous lectures, I think I've mentioned this multiple times that a lot of taxes presently have been collected by the federal government. For instance, income tax is something which is not given to the provincial government in terms of its collection and administration, but rather the federal government throughout the country ensures that through Federal Board of Revenue, FBR, your income taxes are collected. Now, the question is that since the federal government collects these taxes from the entire country, how do you ensure the distribution of these taxes to different provinces? Right, so please bear this in mind. In terms of the National Finance Commission award, only those financial or those resources or taxes are distributed by the federal government which form part of a divisible pool. So, what is a divisible pool? Divisible pool is just that pool or basically that mechanism which includes taxes which can only be actually be divided with the provincial governments. There are certain taxes which cannot or which are not basically included in the divisible pool. In other words, the federal government keeps it for itself and doesn't distribute it with the provincial government. So presently, this divisible pool includes taxes on income, which I just mentioned. It also includes corporate taxes, sales tax, export duties, etc. Right? So, as I mentioned, that NFC award is a constitutional obligation. So, according to the Article 160 of the Constitution, after every 5 years, the president has to constitute this National Finance Commission for a period of 5 years, right? So, once the important thing is that after the expiration of every 5 years, which more or less coincides with the expiration of a term of a government, right? If one government is able to complete it full term. So the idea is that after this expiration, your finance commission needs to be established, right? So once this commission gets established, there needs to be consensus in terms of all the stakeholders on a particular formula in terms of how to distribute the finances. And once this consensus is achieved, the award will be implemented for the next 5 years, right? So, in terms of the stakeholders, the key stakeholders which are involved in the NFC award distribution are the federal government and the provincial governments. And over the period of time, it has been seen that it has been very difficult to actually achieve consensus between the federal government and provincial governments in terms of what is the best way to distribute the resources. Once this particular commission fails to come up with a distribution mechanism, then the practice has been in the case of Pakistan that the previous NFC award or the previous award which was passed has been basically implemented. So, just to let you guys know, currently the NFC award that we are following is the seventh NFC award. In a bit, I'll explain you a bit more about it. And according to that, from the divisible pool, the current distribution formula is that out of all the taxes which are present in the divisible pool, the federal government receives 42.5% of the share of these taxes, whereas the rest of the 57.5% of the taxes actually or financial resources goes to the provinces. And just to let you guys know a bit more about the distribution formula, so up till 2010, that is up till the passage of the 18th Amendment, this distribution of finances was done solely on the basis of population. So, population was the only criteria through which finances were distributed uh, between different provinces, right? So, since a population was the sole sort of criteria, that meant that since Punjab is the most populous province in the country, major share of the resources went to Punjab, right? So, this you can say sort of created some sort of conflict among the other provinces as well. So, as a result, when the seventh NFC award, which was announced in December 2009, was created, it actually changed the formula of distribution of financial resources. It no longer just includes population as the sole criteria for distribution of financial resources, but it actually included new indicators like population. So, population still has a weightage, however, it also includes indicators like poverty and backwardness, which is given a weightage of 10.3%. It also includes an indicator on revenue collection and generation, and another indicator on inverse population density. So basically, the last three indicators were actually advocated by the province of Sindh and Balochistan. Now, for instance, this indicator on revenue collection and generation basically entails that certain provinces which are sparsely populated or which are not doing so well economically, they do not have the capacity to collect large amounts of revenue, and therefore they're unable to generate a lot of revenue. So they feel that these provinces felt that they should not be at a loss just because of their lower revenue collection and generation, and this particular aspect should be factored in the way financial resources are distributed. Similarly, this indicator on poverty and backwardness tries to sort of compensate those areas or those provinces which are not that well developed and they need sort of extra funds or extra aid from the federal government. The last indicator, which is inverse population density. So, inverse population density is basically when your population density decreases, so does your population growth decrease. Balochistan specially advocated for this particular indicator, and the reason why it's advocated for this indicator was that since you know that Balochistan is very sparsely populated, so they wanted that in order to create greater infrastructure development in the mountainous areas of Balochistan, or to ensure that the population growth in these areas increases, we need to be compensated for that as well. So that's why this particular NFC award has been passed. So just to reiterate, this award was passed in December 2009 and it became effective in July 2010. And again, it has been almost 10 years since the passage of the seventh NFC award, which basically aligned or which sort of came into effect in line with the 18th Amendment. So since the passage of the 7th NFC award, we still haven't been able to get a consensus for a new award, right? So up till now, in the present scenario in 2020 as well, the same sort of you can say distribution or NFC award formula has been awarded. And PTI government, when it came to power, it did constitute a new National Finance Commission, but up till now, there hasn't been any sort of consensus or decision made in terms of how the resources need to be actually distributed between the provinces and the federal government. So, this table, I think, very nicely sort of outlines the resource distribution between different NFC awards. So this particular table shows the different NFC awards. So you have the first award in 1974, second in 1979, and we are currently in seventh. So 2009 is the year that the award was actually passed, but it became effective in 2010. So let's take a look here. So the earlier awards basically actually gave more resources or a greater proportion of resources to the provincial government. So 20% would go to the federation, 80% would go to the provincial governments. In terms of distribution within the provinces, Punjab, as you can see, got the greatest share, 60%, as compared to the share of Sindh, NWFP, which was previously known, which is now KPK, and Balochistan would only get 3.86 as a result of its sparse population. Then, in terms of the next award, again, this 2080 bit was the same, it stayed the same, and then you can see these updated figures. This is in line, still in line with the population criteria. Then moving on, let's discuss this particular award. So the sixth NFC award, which was passed in 2006 as a result of the presidential order by General Pervez Musharraf. Here you can see that the share of the federation was actually increased, and the share of the provinces was actually reduced, right? So this was, since you guys know that President Musharraf's government was a dictatorship, so he could unilaterally take these actions, and naturally, the provinces weren't happy with this particular development. So, in terms of the seventh NFC award, which was passed during democratic leadership of the PPP government, this 55% proportion for the federation was actually massively cut down again to 42.5%, and the share of the provinces was included to 57.5%. And please bear this in mind that this seventh NFC ward, this particular these figures were totally changed because now the population criteria was no longer used, but rather you had multiple other indicators as well. And just to see the difference in terms of the change of criteria, so previously in the first NFC award, Balochistan would only get 3.86 percent of the share, but rather now it has, as a result of the seventh NFC war, it has actually changed to 9%, which is like a major gain for the case of Balochistan. And here you can see that Punjab could have, you can say that Punjab was actually worse off as a result of the seventh NFC award, because its proportion over time, its the amount that it was given has been gradually actually decreasing, because it went from 16% and it went down from 16% to 51.7%. So let's move on. So, what has been the effect of the 18th Amendment on the NFC award? The key feature which was introduced by the NFC award was that it has been made binding for the NFC award not to reduce the share of the provinces as compared to previous awards, which basically means that you can no longer reduce the share of 57.5%, but rather you have to increase it in the subsequent awards. Similarly, another key provision was that the federal and provincial finance ministers have to monitor the implementation of this award in a biannual fashion, which means that it needs to be monitored twice a year, and they have to lay a report regarding the implementation of the NFC award in the both houses of the parliament. And previously there was no sort of stipulation related to this particular feature, so now it has been made mandatory that you have to write a report and present a report in both the National Assembly and the Senate. Similarly, now the provinces have actually been given power to raise domestic or foreign loans on their own as a result of the 18th Amendment. There was no such provision available for provinces in the past. However, the condition attached to this particular feature is that the provincial governments have to get prior approval from the National Economic Council, which is also a statutory body which deals with economic affairs of the entire country. I just want to show you in this table some reassignment of taxing powers which happened among different levels of government under the 18th Amendment. So, previously, your federal government would actually collect taxes on estate and inheritance as well. They would also collect, VAT or sales tax on services as well. They would also be in charged with regards to collection and administration of zakat and ushur. However, as a result of the 18th Amendment, these particular taxes have now been deleted from the federal taxing powers, and these powers have been actually given to the provincial governments. However, new taxation powers have been given to the federal government. For instance, federal government can actually now sort of tax on the sale and purchase of goods throughout the country. They can actually now tax tax on the capital value of assets, excluding immovable property, right? So this tax on immovable property is actually now has been designated, or this taxation power has been given to the provincial governments. Similarly, bits which were deleted here, they were added in the case of in terms of provincial taxing powers. So sales tax on services is actually collected by the provincial government, and I think I've mentioned it multiple times before as well. For example, if you go to a restaurant and you have to pay a tax, that particular sales tax is actually decided upon by the provincial government. However, when it comes to sales tax on goods, which is like if you buy a bar of chocolate or if you buy like some fuzzy drink. So that particular tax, which is currently around 17%, that is decided by the federal government and actually collected and administered by the federal government as well. Similarly, zakat and ushur are to be collected by provincial governments as well. I'm sure you already know about what zakat is. Ushur, on the other hand, is any sort of Islamic taxation on the agricultural produce of farmers, etc. And other provincial taxing and financing powers, I've already mentioned that international and domestic borrowing is now allowed for provincial governments as long as they are approved by the National Economic Council. In terms of the local government taxing powers, so there hasn't been any change as a result of 18th Amendment. Because the provincial government, since it has autonomy over local government system, provincial governments basically tend to get to decide which particular taxes can be actually collected by local governments as well. And unfortunately, in the case of Pakistan, local governments haven't been actually empowered quite a lot in terms of giving them any taxation powers. Let's move on. So, this is just the last bit that I wanted to show you in this lecture. So, these are just some examples of taxation which are actually determined by the federal government and provincial governments. In a bit, I'll show you which ones are determined by the provincial governments. So, the F here it basically shows that these are taxes which are determined, the base and the rate of the tax is determined by the federal government. Tax is collected and administered by the federal government, and this since these taxes are part of the divisible pool, so this particular one shows that how much is distributed among the federal government and how much is distributed in the provincial government. So for instance, you have this personal income and corporation tax. The collection, administration, the rate, the base is determined by the federal government. However, it's part of the divisible pool, right? So 42.5% is kept by the federal government, 57.5 is kept by the provincial government. On the other hand, custom duties, export duties on cotton and jute, so all of these are part of the federal government. However, they are not part of the divisible pool. This means that 100% of the share in net revenue is kept with the federal government and is not shared with the provincial government. Similarly, your excise duties on opium, liquor, narcotics, etc. All of these are also part of the divisible pool, right? Similarly, I just want to show you another example. Yeah, so you have capital value tax on immovable assets, right? So this particular tax is determined by the federal government, the base and the rate. However, it's collected and administered by the provincial government, and it's actually given to the federal government. Interestingly, like the entire 100% is kept or given to the federal government, and the provincial government collects it on the behalf of the federal government. Similarly, surcharge on natural gas, this is also collected and administered by the provincial government. However, all this revenue is kept with the provincial government, and the federal government gets like a zero share in this, right? Similarly, just some more examples. So, property taxes, the base is determined by the provincial government, right? The rate can be determined by the provincial government as well as the local government. They can be collected and administered by both provincial and local governments, depending on how much autonomy is given to the provincial government. And this is in terms of the share of proportion. So these are taxes, all of these, since they are given to the provincial governments, right? So the federal government has a zero share in these taxes. So let's look at some more taxes: agriculture income tax, capital gains tax, cotton fee, electricity duty, court fee, education cess. All of these taxes have been under the portfolio or under the domain of provincial governments, and all the policy making related to these taxes is made by provincial governments as opposed to federal government. So this basically concludes our lecture on intergovernmental administration. I hope you guys were able to get a good grasp of the theory and practice of federalism in general. And I hope you were able to understand federalism from the context of Pakistan as well, by sort of looking at different legislative reforms that we have had in Pakistan. We also looked at some of the institutional mechanisms which are in place, which sort of aid intergovernmental relations, right? Now, once again, if you guys have any questions related to this particular session, please feel free to email me, or you can just message me on MS Teams as well, right? For the next lecture, we are going to be discussing administrative reforms. So make sure that prior to watching this lecture, you should have read chapter 22 on administrative reforms in Pakistan from this book, Public Administration in South Asia. This particular book, as you know already, is already available on LMS, right? So that's all for this lecture. See you guys in the next lecture.